A driver was approaching Steve's Hill Cemetery when, from a distance, he noticed something strange on the road. He slowed down and saw that it was a little girl. She was completely alone, filthy, covered in something red, and there were no adults anywhere nearby. That was the moment the world learned of the Nepier family tragedy. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The events of today's story took place in a tiny town called Laurel, Indiana, a god-forsaken place where the streets are lined with old, run-down houses and the sidewalks are cracked and uneven. Yet there's a sense of calm and peace here that's hard to find in big cities. Laurel is beautiful rural countryside, surrounded by hills, centuries-old forests, and clear creeks. An ideal spot to relax and enjoy the outdoors. Most residents of Laurel were born here, grew up here, and stayed for life. New people almost never showed up. The 2010 census recorded just 512 residents. Everyone was either related or had known each other since they were in diapers. They were friendly and welcoming, always ready to lend a hand. A very strong sense of community bound them together, since many families had lived there for generations. The downside was that finding work was extremely difficult. Many homes in Laurel were mobile homes because they were more affordable. Just outside town was an even more secluded area. Along Steve's Hill Road, a few houses were scattered far apart. Most were trailers and mobile homes. The people living in that part of town mostly raised livestock and farmed. The Nepier family had long been part of Laurel's history, having lived there for generations. The Richardson family, who lived on the same street, was no different. Angela Richardson was born June 12, 1964. Both her mother and father had grown up in large families, so it was no surprise that they had 9 children of their own, 5 sons and 4 daughters. Everyone called Angela Angie. Her great-grandfather had settled in Laurel in the 1930s and died there in old age, leaving behind 6 children. That's how this big story began in a small town. Roy Darrell Nepier was born December 12, 1960. His parents divorced, and he was raised by his mother Shirley and stepfather Albert Cummins. The Cummins family was another well-known name in Laurel. They farmed and owned a large piece of land. Roy's mother and stepfather were hard-working people who taught him from a young age to value discipline, work ethic, and loyalty. Roy Nepier and Angie Richardson had known each other since childhood. Over time, their friendship turned into serious feelings, and in 1984, they married. Just 1 year later, in April 1985, their son Joshua was born. Now, they were a full-fledged Nepier family. Angie and Roy worked hard to build a comfortable life for themselves and their little boy. Roy was quiet, but a hard worker. His main goal was to provide for his growing family. Angie and Roy both came from large families, so they always knew they would have at least 3 children. 3 years later, in April 1988, their daughter Melissa was born. Now there were 4 of them. Roy was a decent carpenter who had lately specialized in drywall installation. Since good jobs were scarce in Laurel, he took whatever work he could find. His attention to detail and responsibility made him a valued worker. Clients knew that if Roy took a job, it would be done perfectly and on time. In his free time, he watched TV. He was a die-hard football fan. Sometimes friends who were also fans would come over. They'd watch their favorite team together and then play poker. The problem with small towns is there's absolutely nothing to do, especially back then, before everyone had internet and social media. Those evenings with friends and family were the brightest moments in Roy's life and for the whole Nepier family. In Laurel, they had plenty of relatives who were always ready to help. While Roy worked, Angie took care of Melissa and Joshua. Once the kids started school, she got a job as a waitress at a diner in the center of town. Later, she worked for a while in a hardware and paint store, contributing to the family budget. She also spent a lot of time tending the yard, loved cooking, and going mushroom hunting in the woods. In Laurel, mushroom hunts were a real event, a tradition. The season started in mid-April and lasted about a month. People went out very early in the morning to search for morels. For Laurel residents, it was practically a sport. These days, there's even a Facebook group where county maps are updated in real time showing where and when mushrooms are popping up. People proudly post photos of their best hauls. Angie and Roy were good people who worked hard, lived simply, and loved their family. 5 years after Melissa was born, in October 1993, another son, Jacob, arrived. Although a baby is always a joy, it's also another mouth to feed and clothe. By the time the kids were older, Roy and Angie were barely making ends meet. In 2004, when Joshua was 19, Melissa 16, and Jacob 11, Roy turned to his mother for help. Shirley owned a lot of land on Steve's Hill Road. Shirley Cummins helped Roy buy a trailer that they placed right next to her house. That way they were closer to her, and she could help more often with the kids. At the same time, the Nepiers didn't have to worry about rent or buying a house. Shirley was happy to help her son. She loved him and Angie, whom she'd known since childhood, and enjoyed spending time with her grandchildren. Even with his mother's help, Roy and Angie still had to work hard just to stay afloat. Roy had suffered multiple injuries on the job. His back constantly hurt, and he needed regular treatment. Eventually, the damage to his health became so severe that he could no longer work. Roy was declared disabled and spent the last years on painkillers. The 5 of them lived in a small trailer in the middle of fields, but they remained optimistic and never gave up. The kids first attended the only elementary school in Laurel, a 15-minute walk along dirt roads. Then they moved to the middle high school in Brookville, about a 30-minute drive from Laurel. The children grew older, and so did their needs. Living in a cramped trailer with no money caused a lot of arguments. The situation weighed heavily on Roy, the head of the household. He and Angie began fighting frequently. At one point, Angie decided to move out. She rented another trailer a little farther down the road. She wanted her own space, but she still came to Roy and the kids almost every day. The 2 trailers were only a few minutes' walk apart. The Nepier kids did everything they could to help their parents. Youngest son, Jacob, worked on a farm baling hay. Oldest son, Joshua, also did various chores around the house. The young man was ambitious and wanted the family to achieve financial stability. He tried to help Roy and take full control of the situation. Melissa was studying hard at the time, dreaming of becoming a certified nurse, and spent a lot of time with her boyfriend Lucas. She hoped one day to build a career and leave Laurel, or at least leave the trailer where she currently lived with her father and 2 brothers. But dreams remained just dreams, because soon the trailer was filled with a baby's cries again. In 2008, Melissa and Lucas had a daughter named Sierra. Lucas and Melissa were determined to give their little girl a better life. Since they were still very young, Melissa was only 20, they relied completely on help from her parents. Angie and Roy were thrilled to become grandparents. Little Sierra brought enormous joy into the home and gave their world new meaning. When everything around them seemed to be falling apart, their granddaughter became the bond that held the Nepier family together. Angie spent more and more time with the baby and with Roy. Still, Angie and Roy never fully repaired their marriage and eventually decided to separate. Surprisingly, once they realized they were better as close friends than as husband and wife, their relationship improved. Angie felt comfortable coming to Roy's trailer to be with the family, and a couple of years after the breakup, she decided to move on with her life and started dating a man named Jim Wilson. Jim lived in Decatur County, almost 3 hours from Laurel, and Angie eventually moved in with him, but whenever she could, she drove to the trailer to see her family. Jim wasn't thrilled about those trips, but nothing could stop Angie from seeing her loved ones. She was very proud of her grown children. Melissa had just finished her training and earned her certificate. Her sons had found jobs and were now supporting their father and themselves. Roy was still recovering from his back injury and couldn't work because of his disability. Things weren't perfect, but they were managing to get by. September 25th, 2011, everything changed forever. Around 1:30 p.m., a random driver was coming down the hill. Right in front of Steve's Hill Cemetery, he saw something strange in the middle of the road and couldn't immediately tell what it was. As he got closer and slowed down, he realized it was a little girl walking alone in the road with no adults around. The man pulled over to make sure the child was okay. The girl's eyes were red from crying, her hair was a mess, and she was covered in something. When he got closer, he saw it wasn't dirt, it was blood. Shocked, the driver couldn't understand how this tiny child ended up completely alone near a cemetery with no houses nearby. He asked where her mommy was, and the girl's answer stunned him even more. She said her mommy was dead. The situation felt unreal, like a nightmare, except the child was standing right in front of him, with crosses and headstones rising on both sides of the road. The driver called 911 and reported the child on the highway. Police arrived instantly. This was the only road in or out of the area. Eventually, the little girl was identified as 3-year-old Sierra, daughter of 23-year-old Melissa Nepier, and granddaughter of Angie and Roy. Her great-grandmother Shirley Cummins, who owned land in the area, was notified that her great-granddaughter had been found wandering alone. She rushed over, horrified that Sierra could have been hit by a car or gotten lost in the woods and never found. Shirley was ready to be furious with her son Roy and granddaughter Melissa for not watching the child closely enough to let her walk so far from home. She rocked the little girl in her arms, calming her, and when she asked what happened, she nearly fainted from shock herself. Sierra said her mommy, grandma, and grandpa were dead and she didn't know where to go. Honestly, Shirley couldn't believe what she was hearing. It meant her son was gone, along with his ex-wife. What could have happened? What scared Sierra so badly that she left the house? Why was she left alone? There were too many questions, and the police took over finding the answers. Officers headed to the Nepier family trailer to figure out what really happened. Shirley told them where her son and his family lived. As soon as the officers looked inside the mobile home, they knew they needed backup, including major crime detectives. They called Indiana State Police for help, and in the meantime, searched the outside area to make sure the perpetrator wasn't hiding nearby and still a threat. Suddenly, they spotted a man moving through the bushes near the Nepier home. Officers ordered him to stop, but instead the man took off running toward the woods as fast as he could. The stranger disappeared in seconds. He clearly knew the area well, and they never caught him. Police frantically searched the surroundings for evidence and eventually found an abandoned vehicle. Most likely it belonged to the fleeing man, someone who didn't want to talk to law enforcement. They ran the plates, just in case. The truck was registered to a local man named Dustin Lane. Now Dustin Lane was on the police radar. There was no telling what connection he might have to whatever happened inside the Nepier trailer. Soon there were at least 5 police cars at the scene. Residents, seeing several emergency vehicles speeding down their quiet country road, started coming outside and talking among themselves. They didn't yet know what had happened, but they could feel something terrible had. For most longtime locals, a large police presence meant a catastrophe. Nothing stays secret long in a small town. Word of the crime at the Nepier place spread instantly. Everyone was speculating what could have caused such a commotion in their sleepy community, even though the detectives themselves hadn't figured it out yet. When an Indiana State Police sergeant arrived, he was told there were multiple victims inside the trailer. He only had to glance through the window to see the horrific scene awaiting them. Officers held off entering the home to preserve evidence. While waiting for the crime scene team, local deputies focused on finding Dustin Lane, the man who had run into the woods. The danger was that the fugitive might be armed and capable of anything if cornered. Meanwhile, several detectives finally entered the trailer to assess the situation. The first thing that hit them was pools of blood. Blood was splattered everywhere in the small space. Right in the middle of the living room lay 2 lifeless bodies, A little farther back were two more. Two men and two women, covered in red almost beyond recognition. It was beyond comprehension. They knew what they were looking at, but didn't want to believe such a horrific crime could happen in their quiet town. 4 people were dead. It was the most shocking incident in Laurel's entire history. First, the victims had to be identified. Neighbors and Shirley Cummins confirmed that Roy Nepier lived in the trailer with his children, Jacob, Melissa, and Joshua. But according to 3-year-old Sierra, the victims included her mother, Melissa, her grandma, Angie, and her grandpa, Roy. That was only preliminary identification. In reality, investigators couldn't even properly examine the scene inside the trailer yet. The bodies took up the entire small living area, surrounded by scattered belongings. Empty wallets lay on the floor. Victims' pockets were turned inside out. Drawers had been pulled out and their contents dumped. There were empty food containers, pill bottles, prescription slips, newspapers, magazines, TV remotes, children's toys, and spent shell casings. At first glance, it was impossible to tell what was evidence and what was everyday clutter. It looked as if someone had been searching for money or valuables and simply tossed everything else on the floor. Now those items were soaked in blood. All the victims had been shot. Could one of them have done it and then turned the gun on themselves? The questions kept growing. While detectives tried to collect evidence inside, they were told there were blood drops outside the trailer too. The perpetrator may have been injured, so specialists carefully followed the trail step by step until they found another body. The 5th victim lay face up on the ground, but there wasn't much of a face left. It had been beaten into a pulp. By the size, it was an adult male, clearly not the person who had killed the 4 inside. It could have been one of Roy and Angie's adult sons, but that doubt was quickly cleared up. The last victim's pockets hadn't been emptied. Inside was a wallet with ID belonging to Henry Smith. His cell phone lay next to the body and was immediately taken for examination. Although the area around Henry's body was soaked in blood, the phone was perfectly clean, as if someone had wiped it carefully before placing it there. The battery was dead, so no further information could be obtained right away. The phone was sent to the crime lab, along with other evidence for forensic analysis. Strangely, no other cell phones were found in the trailer and no firearm either. All 5 deaths were ruled homicides. That meant the person who had killed 5 innocent people was still at large. Locals immediately decided the killer must be an outsider, 100% certain no one from their town could do something so monstrous. While the investigative team worked inside the trailer, a man approached one of the police cars parked behind the tape. He looked rough, his whole body scratched and bleeding, fresh bruises on his face and hands. He asked to speak with detectives. It was none other than Dustin Lane, the man who had fled into the woods hours earlier. Everyone knows criminals sometimes return to the scene, but this man claimed he came back to clear his name. Dustin explained he had done some work for Roy Nepier and had come to collect payment. Lane had a record, so when he saw all the police cars, he panicked and ran. He insisted he had nothing to do with what happened inside the trailer. He hadn't even reached it when he saw the officers. When locals told him about the horrific crime, he returned to explain his flight and clear his name. It sounded plausible, but Dustin Lane stayed on the suspect list. However, another name was now added. Evidence collection and the investigation went on for hours, from morning until night. All 5 victims were transported to the Forensic Pathology Institute in Indianapolis, Indiana, for autopsies. Finally, the bodies were officially identified. They were 50-year-old family head Roy Nepier, his 47-year-old ex-wife Angela Nepier, their 23-year-old daughter Melissa, Sierra's mother, and their 17-year-old son Jacob, who would have turned 18 in just a few weeks. The 5th victim was 43-year-old Henry Smith, a neighbor who lived across the road from the trailer. Sierra said Henry had helped her escape the house. That likely explained why he was outside when he saved the girl. He was the Nepier family's best friend. He spent a lot of time with them, helped around the house, and played with the kids. One piece of evidence at the scene clearly belonged to the potential killer, a bloody shoe print from an athletic sneaker with a distinctive sole pattern. Investigators also found something interesting in the bedroom nightstand. A restraining order application filled out by Roy Nepier against his own son, 26-year-old Joshua. Just a week before his death, Roy had gone to the courthouse. He wanted to keep his oldest son away from him. It was clear the father feared his own child for some reason, and Joshua was not among the victims found in the trailer. Family disputes often escalate from arguments to violence. In light of this new information, Joshua Nepier became suspect number 1. Roy's mother, Shirley Cummins, explained the situation at the Nepier home to officers. She said Roy had kicked his oldest son out a week earlier. They argued often because Joshua wanted to control everything, including the family finances. He wanted to take over running the household, taking advantage of his father's disability and poor health. Roy didn't like being pushed out of his role as head of the family, so he threw the young man out and went further. He filed for a protective order, with a hearing scheduled for that very week. It was entirely possible Joshua had resented his father and been jealous that his brother and sister were allowed to stay in the trailer while he had to move in with his girlfriend. For the Nepier relatives, losing several loved ones at once felt unbearable and senseless. They knew there were occasional arguments at Roy's place, but no one could have imagined it would end like this. What sense was there in wiping out an entire family that had no wealth and had never harmed anyone? The crime sent shockwaves through all of Laurel. Schools were put on lockdown, children were handed directly to parents, and outdoor activities were temporarily suspended. Since no one had been arrested yet, further attacks were possible, so administrators decided to err on the side of caution. The lockdown was just a precaution. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with the terrible news. A huge number of reporters descended on the quiet place, eager for first-hand accounts, interviewing anyone willing to talk. The investigation continued, but slower than anyone wanted. The problem was that detectives simply didn't know who to look for or where to start. The exact time of the crime was still unknown. Sierra was found around 1:30 p.m., but no one knew how long she had been walking to the cemetery. One neighbor thought she heard shots around noon, but she wasn't sure. Police suspected various people, including Joshua Nepier. They didn't have far to look. The young man lived with his girlfriend just a few miles from his father's trailer. As soon as Joshua heard about the tragedy, he rushed to the scene, even though officers had already put out a search for him after not finding him at home. When he was told his parents and siblings had been shot, he broke down in tears. Once the initial emotions subsided, officers asked Joshua why his father had filed a restraining order against him. It seemed to come as news to him. The oldest son had a difficult relationship with his father, but he claimed he'd never heard anything about a restraining order. Joshua said his parents argued more about their own relationship issues. Angie's new boyfriend didn't like Roy, and Roy strongly disliked him in return. The ex-husband couldn't accept that Angie had left and was now living with another man. Jim Wilson and Roy Nepier, to put it mildly, couldn't stand each other. Jim got upset whenever Angie went to the trailer to see her kids, and Roy was distressed when she went back to Jim. He still couldn't come to terms with his wife leaving the family and moving so far away. According to Joshua, Jim harbored deep, hidden hatred toward his father. He had tried countless times to stop Angie from visiting the trailer and spending time with her family. As it later turned out, a car was parked not far from the trailer, and no one had come for it yet. The plates showed it belonged to James Wilson, Angela's new partner. Joshua himself helped police figure out what connection this man had to the Nepier family. Since Jim clearly wasn't fond of Roy, could he have committed such a horrific crime? Until the killer was in custody, everyone remained under suspicion. Joshua told officers he had spent the entire night and morning at his girlfriend's house. In reality, he would have preferred to be at the family trailer so he could have confronted the attacker and tried to save his loved ones. The young man spoke sincerely, But who knows? He might have been a good actor. What bothered the police was the footwear Joshua was wearing, athletic sneakers with the exact sole pattern that left the bloody print at the trailer entrance. They asked him to hand over the shoes for testing to compare with the evidence. After that, they let Joshua go, but put him under surveillance. Meanwhile, detectives explored other leads. First on the list was what Sierra might say. She had been an unwitting eyewitness to the massacre. Though a 3-year-old's testimony couldn't be relied on completely, everything she had said so far had checked out. Investigators spoke with her temporary guardians. They learned Sierra had mentioned Uncle Jim hurting her mommy. Though it came from a child's mouth, Jim's car was parked near the crime scene, and he certainly had a motive. The crime lab returned results on the phone found next to the 5th victim. It belonged to Angela Nepier. The SIM card had been removed and all text messages deleted, but the contact list remained and could be checked. Strangely, Angie's phone had no numbers for Roy or son Jacob, only Melissa's. Police decided to track the location of one of the victims' phones. None had been found in the trailer. Cell phone pinging is a long and tedious process, so detectives didn't expect quick results. In the meantime, they paid a visit to Jim Wilson. Police showed up at Wilson's house early in the morning. First, they asked how his car ended up on Steve's Hill near the crime scene. The explanation was convincing. Angie had taken it to visit her family. When asked if he had heard anything about the bloody massacre in Laurel, he said he'd seen it on the news, but didn't know details. The detectives then asked directly if he was aware that his girlfriend Angela Nepier had been shot along with her family. The man froze, speechless with shock. He couldn't believe Angie was really gone. Jim nervously explained to the officers how much he hated those trips, and it wasn't just jealousy. What bothered him was that strangers kept showing up at the Nepier trailer. Angie had told him herself. He had asked her to meet the kids on neutral ground, but Roy was still family to her, and no one could make her give up those visits. Roy, now disabled from his back injury, had fallen into despair over money and started selling his prescription painkillers. Empty prescription bottles had indeed been found at the scene. Drugs meant only for severe pain, injuries, even cancer. Because of the euphoric high, people began abusing them. Those were exactly the kind of addicts Jim feared, while he was 3 hours away and unable to protect Angie if needed. On the morning of Sunday, the day of the murders, Jim had a solid alibi. He was hosting a barbecue with friends. Police called his buddies, and they all confirmed he had been there the whole time. It was far enough away that slipping out, committing the crime, and returning unnoticed would have been nearly impossible. He had no criminal record, so for now all suspicion was lifted from him. But the information about missing prescription drugs piqued investigators' interest. They had already heard from locals that Roy was selling pills. Since no drugs were found in the trailer, they had dismissed it as gossip. To confirm or refute the story, detectives went back to Joshua Nepier and told him straight out they knew what his father had been doing. Joshua didn't deny it. He admitted his father sometimes sold pills to make a little money while suffering constant pain. That was the main reason for their arguments. The oldest son didn't like what his father was doing. But at that point in life, it was Roy's only way to support the family, so he wasn't about to let Joshua stand in his way. Opioid addiction in remote areas of Indiana is one of the state's biggest problems, and unfortunately, it became an indirect cause of an entire family's death. As soon as the Nepiers started making ends meet, in 2008, the family grew again. Little Sierra was born. A child always means extra expenses. Money was desperately short. With almost no jobs in rural areas like Laurel, people have little chance to improve their lives. It's a vicious cycle. Heavy manual labor is the only work available, and it often leads to injury. People seek medical help but don't want to lose their jobs, so instead of treating the underlying problem, they just mask the pain with medication. That's exactly what happened to Roy Nepier. His condition turned into a disability, and the family still had to eat. so the man found a small side income. Police asked Joshua if any buyers had seemed suspicious, anyone who owed money or acted strangely. Joshua remembered one guy. He didn't even know his name, but something about him stood out. He didn't know the buyer's address but offered to show where the house was. He had once gone with his father to deliver pills there. The house belonged to a woman named Berlina Blondie Richardson. Detectives learned she lived with her son David Ison and was a distant relative of Angie, née Richardson. That same year, just a few months earlier, there had been an armed pharmacy robbery. The robber tried to smash the display glass and was badly injured in the process. His blood landed on a pharmacist. He escaped, but DNA identified him. The robber was David Ison, with more than 20 prior convictions. Police even had an active warrant for him, but he was on the run and the pharmacy case remained unsolved. David was wanted for trying to steal prescription pills. Now Joshua had pointed to him as a regular buyer from his father. Someone the police knew as David Ison might go to extreme lengths for his fix. He had spent most of his adult life in prison and could easily slaughter an entire family. Police obtained a search warrant for Azan's home and planned to arrest him at the first opportunity. Melissa Nepier's missing phone was last pinged in the area where David lived. The takedown was scheduled for September 28th. SWAT didn't want to storm the house. There was no telling how a man like that might react. They needed him alive. This was potentially the person who had murdered an entire family. The team waited until David and his girlfriend got into their car to leave. They were arrested at a nearby gas station when Azen least expected it. The most surprising part? The man was wearing a fake beard and glasses. He may have been in disguise and ready to flee again at any moment. In the trunk, they found a loaded handgun and a rifle, another violation since he was prohibited from owning firearms. At Azen's house, they recovered bloody clothing, Melissa Nepier's cell phone, and athletic shoes whose sole pattern matched the bloody print at the crime scene. The sneakers had been washed, however, so blood traces could no longer be proven. When David asked why he was being arrested, officers first mentioned the pharmacy robbery. When they brought up Roy Nepier, Azen acted like he'd never heard the name, even though rumors about the massacre were all over town. He didn't look scared or nervous. As soon as the conversation turned to the dead, he shut down and asked for a lawyer. A man with multiple convictions knew how to behave in an interrogation. Bail was set at $5 million, $1 million for each life police believed he had taken. He hadn't yet been formally charged with the trailer murders, but every piece of circumstantial evidence pointed to him. The arrest brought relief to the public. On one hand, people breathed easier knowing the killer was behind bars. On the other, they didn't want to believe one of their own, who lived next door and walked the same streets, could do this. The news stunned the community and made everyone look more closely at their neighbors. Who knew what secrets were hidden behind closed doors? Some were convinced police had arrested the wrong man. For the person who had lost his entire family overnight, the arrest was a small comfort. 26-year-old Joshua Nepier now had to organize funerals for 4 family members. Locals donated money. They knew Joshua had nothing to give his loved ones a proper send-off. Laurel didn't even have a funeral home big enough for 4 coffins at once, or enough hearses. Vehicles had to be brought in from other towns. The Nepier family was buried at the same cemetery where the passing driver had found little Sierra wandering alone. Not far from Roy, Angie, Melissa, and Jacob, they buried family friend Henry Smith, who had given his life to save Sierra. Charges for the murder of 5 people were formally filed against David Ison on October 9, 2011. When the suspect realized the walls were closing in, he started blaming his girlfriend while denying everything himself. The woman arrested with Azen was his live-in girlfriend, Amanda Nepier. Yes, she had the same last name as the victims, but no direct relation. It turned out the name came from an ex-husband who also had no connection to Roy and Angie, just a coincidence of surnames. In a town of just over 500 people, that wasn't unusual. Perhaps their distant ancestors had been related. Her ex-husband told police Amanda had started dating David without knowing how dangerous he was. Once she realized, she couldn't leave because of threats against her 3 children who lived with their father. Azen warned he would kill not only Amanda, but the kids too, so she stayed out of fear. But fear wasn't the only thing keeping her with him. She had fallen deep into addiction herself. Leaving David meant losing her supply. On her own, she had neither money nor access to the next high. Deep down, Amanda wanted to change her life, go back to college, become a nurse. But the addiction was stronger than her human desires. Authorities wanted to know if this woman had any involvement in the deaths of 5 people in the Nepier trailer. At that point, she wasn't charged with murder. On September 30th, she was arrested for conspiracy to commit the pharmacy robbery. Her connection to the trailer massacre still had to be determined. During questioning, Amanda told investigators she had stayed in the car while David went to Roy's to buy pills. He came back and said he had argued with the owner. She claimed she didn't even know David was armed when he went inside. On October 13th, 2011, a hearing was held where Azen pleaded not guilty to all 5 murder charges. He was brought to court in shackles and a bulletproof vest, fearing revenge from angry relatives. Even without the death penalty on the table, he faced multiple life sentences, one for each Nepier family member. Evidence against David kept piling up. He realized denying everything was pointless, and on February 14th, 2012, Valentine's Day, David Ison accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty. In exchange, he avoided execution and received life without parole. Even the judge said David claimed to feel remorse. But when one of the victim's relatives shouted a curse at him, he immediately fired back with profanity. It became clear the man felt no regret at all for taking 5 innocent lives and would gladly do it again. Joshua Nepier, the young man who had lost his entire family in one day, was unhappy with the deal. In his view, Azen didn't deserve to keep his life. David's family could still visit him in prison, but Joshua would never again see his mother, father, sister, or little brother. Prison for David was like a second home. 3 meals a day, opportunities for self-improvement, and life continuing, even if never free again. Poor little Sierra now lives with her father. She will carry the memory of those horrific moments when her loved ones died in front of her. Joshua has been forbidden from seeing the girl. It would cause her too much pain, so in essence, he has lost that last connection to his late sister as well. The only consolation was that the plea deal forced David to tell the full truth about what happened in the Nepier trailer on September 25, 2011. David Azen's addiction to prescription opioids had completely taken over his life. He paid for it not only with cash, but with his health. Missing even 1 dose made him violently ill. He would do anything to make the pain stop and get more pills. He usually bought from Roy Nepier, whose back pain earned him strong prescriptions. When money was short, he stole pills from pharmacies or acquaintances. This time the craving was especially bad, so he arranged to buy 50 pills at once and told Roy in advance. He and Amanda drove to the Nepier place on Steves Hill Road, but Roy had bad news. He only had 30 pills left. Worse, Roy had raised the price from $10 to $12 each. He explained he had lost his insurance and now paid full price for his own meds. That was why the increase. David felt cheated. He was sure Roy had sold his pills to someone else and was now gouging him. A heated argument broke out. Azen refused to pay a penny more. Roy refused to lower the price. At that moment, Roy's ex-wife Angie and adult children Jacob and Melissa were in the trailer with little Sierra. Hearing the shouting, they got involved. Melissa told David to pay full price or leave. She made some sudden movement toward him, and that was the moment he snapped. He decided he would take the pills no matter what. If they wouldn't sell, he would take them by force. David pulled a gun, pointed it at Melissa, and fired. Angie, standing nearby, lunged at him with her fists. He beat her face and then shot her too. He had to kill Roy and Jacob as well, or they would have killed him. Once he was sure everyone inside was dead, he ransacked the place looking for pills, dumping drawers on the floor while stuffing anything valuable into his pockets: phones, cash, cheap jewelry he could pawn. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement in the kitchen, Sierra hiding. Then, neighbor and family friend Henry Smith suddenly appeared in the doorway. Henry had heard the shots and run over to help. He instantly realized his friends were dead, grabbed Sierra, and ran outside. Somehow he got her out. He told her to run as far away as possible while he tried to hold Azen off. Azen caught up, beat Henry's face to a pulp in rage, then shot him in the chest. David wanted no witnesses. When he finished, he noticed the little girl had escaped. Figuring a 3-year-old couldn't identify him, he dismissed her existence. David spoke about it all with ice-cold detachment, as if taking human lives was nothing special. In his mind, they were to blame for standing in his way. Amanda Nepier was convicted as an accomplice. She sat in the car while David executed Roy's family. She heard the shots but did nothing, didn't intervene, didn't call police, and went on living with Azen. By then, addiction had likely stripped away whatever humanity she had left. In 2014, Amanda Nepier was sentenced to 12 years in prison plus probation. In total, she served 20 years. Even David's 64-year-old mother, Berlina Blondie Richardson, was arrested for illegally buying a semi-automatic firearm for her son. A mother paid dearly for her foolishness. 5 deaths and several families shattered by grief. It all came down to a tiny pill that has destroyed millions of lives on Earth. Addicts will commit any crime for the next high. Even the people closest to them, once loved, cannot stop them. But can any substance ever be worth a human life? If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.